All right, welcome to another episode of the Esoteric Scholar, where we're diving into everything occult and kind of demystifying things a little bit. Today we have BJ Swain with him. And did I pronounce that right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. And we're going to talk about his new book, Luminarium, a Grimoire of Cunning Conjuration. And if you're not familiar with his works, he had a previous book, Living Spirits, a guide to magic in a world of spirits. And he kind of calls that a field guide to spirits, which is a really interesting book as well. So we're going to dig into this today and allow BJ to introduce himself. So go ahead, tell me a little bit about you.
Well, I've been involved in magic most of my life. Sort of grew up working with contemporary neo-pagan magic and then sort of more traditional paganism and ceremonial magic. I was involved with the OTO for a very long time and have kind of sort of been focusing on more traditional magic, both in the sense of like traditional European grimoire magic and traditional witchcraft or historical witchcraft, not necessarily the Robert Cochrane style traditional witchcraft.
Not even the Gerald Gardner, huh? Just more back to the traditional older style, correct?
Yep.
That's nice. I think there's a revival coming in that as well, where people are starting to be more antiquarian in nature for that, to see what the true roots are and bring that back. So that's cool that you were into that a little bit. So tell us about this new book, The Luminarium, and how you came up with the ideas and the name, and a little bit about what it is.
Well, the idea sort of started out with looking at everything that was going on with people being in lockdown and kind of being stuck at home and not having access to a lot of stuff. And it seemed like a good time for people to be exploring new things. And I was looking at different media that I had that I could put out and different things that I could create and put out. But while I was doing that, it occurred to me that it might be interesting to put out some sort of text that gave people a simple way of working on conjuration in order to get people started who were having trouble making that leap from curiosity or from reading about things to actually doing it. And so I started working on a project for building a simple set of planetary conjuration rituals. And that expanded out into developing a book for kind of a simplified system of preparing for conjuration and then actually executing the conjurations. So the project kind of got a little bigger than I had initially anticipated it being. And then I determined that I wanted to have people sort of test run it before I put it out in order to see how people outside of myself did with working with it. And so that added a few weeks to it. So at this point, we're kind of in a phase where people are coming out of their lockdowns, but hopefully it'll still be something that's simple enough that people can get started and hit the ground running with it with very little preparation time.
I think that it is very needed in the modern world, where you can have a very truncated version of it and bringing it right to the forefront, so people who have that curiosity and that can learn the fundamentals quickly and then just start the practice without having to be bogged down with so much depth to symbolism and astrological or planetary timings, things like that. Make it not, I don't want to say dumbed down, because that's not correctly used, but like bring it down to the level where people who have lives can just jump in and start working with it. I think that's a perfect time for that, and especially in the modern world with everyone's 9 to 5 and 3 children and everything going on. So you were talking about, this is, you kind of started out more with the planetary conjuration rituals and things like that. Is that the main focus, with that combines other things as well, or kind of elaborate a little bit on that, how that plays into this book?
Well, the planetary conjurations are the main focus. In fact, the title of the book, Luminarium, is kind of a twofold reference. The title means the lights or concerning the lights. And so that is basically a reference to the planets. But the conjuration system also uses a ritual from the Greek magical papyri for working with a lamp in order to illuminate the conjurer and allow them not to be succumbed by the darkness of the conjuration. And so essentially it makes it so that the conjurer has a greater ability to see and understand and experience what it is that they're conjuring. And so that concept of the light is basically where the title comes from. The rituals that are presented are all planetary conjuration rituals, but leading up to that, it has a series of preparations that the magician can do so that they are able to put themselves in a space to better be able to conjure. And in traditional grimoires, that's mostly just a matter of fasting, abstaining, not drinking, going to mass, saying prayers. And this gives a wide array of different approaches so that some of that can be approached in a shorter time frame and in a way that can maybe kind of amp the magician up if they don't have like years of experience behind themselves. And then following those preparations and the rituals, there's a series of examples of sort of spell work that someone could do by working with a combination of folk magic and the Solomonic Pentacles, with having used them within the context of these conjurations. And so those are, of course, planetary because they're using the pentacles as a basis. But you could take this approach and, with minor adaptations, move it outside of that planetary framework. It could be used for any sort of conjuration.
When you're talking about the planetary invocations and you're talking about the planetary system, the Greek papyri, all of that, are you also including into this works with like the Olympic spirits or any type of angelic entities that rule over the planetary spheres? How do you weave that together into this?
Well, you could use these conjurations with the Olympic spirits. I tend to find that keeping things simple with the Olympic spirits works fairly well. So even simpler than the method presented here, the method of the orbital, basically 2 prayers. So there's not much reason to use this for that. But as far as the traditional archangels of the planets, Luminarium presents prayers to use for calling the archangels, and then presents an optional addition to each of the rituals for using to call upon the aerial kings and their ministers if you want something that's a little bit more on the ground and materially focused than the archangels would be. The book also has a series of explanations of the experiences of people who tried out the methods given, and one of them did work with conjuring a demon using it, and so it talks about that a little bit in the kind of tester section that gives experiences, and so it's pretty easy to modify for that kind of thing too. So the rituals that are presented are set up either for conjuring the archangels of the planets or for the aerial spirits of the planets, but you could conjure pretty much anything with a little bit of adaptation.
Pretty nice that it's universal. I agree with you on the Olympic spirits. I have 7 little mini altars that I have set up to the Olympic spirits, and they seem pretty content with having the candle, a little bit of offering, and a prayer every now and then, and they still like to communicate with you with just that little bit of focus. So yeah, you're very right that they're pretty simple, not in a negative sense there. Now let's talk a little bit about kind of how you came about like putting these together, because with when you simplify something down, I often wonder, if I simplify this down, am I missing the point or the deeper symbolism that they may not have a predisposition to, and at that point maybe having problems or maybe not conveying it correctly? How do you overcome those kind of challenges when you start taking your advanced knowledge and bringing it down to something simpler?
Well, I think some of that is something that over time of working with these systems and delving into them, it becomes natural to find ways to do that because you just become more experienced with them and gain greater facility with them. And so you can start to see where things come together and what things are needed and what things aren't. But I think there's also an element of if we look at the materials that are there as far as traditional conjuration, there are some examples of fairly simple methods. And so, obviously, of course, the Arbitel is one, but then Art of Drawing Spirits into Crystals, where a lot of people have started with that. That's a very simple method. If we look at the way that John Dee went about conjuring the angels in order to receive the Enochian system, what he did is something that looks a lot like Art of Drawing Spirits into Crystals. Like, that was a very simple method. The materials we have left behind for the cunning folk often show fairly simple methods of conjuration. So I think historically there's definitely evidence that conjuration was not always this huge big production that looking at like the Key of Solomon would make us think that it is. And so trying to explore what pieces are the pieces that are kind of consistent can be a way to do that and figure out what things are actually needed to be there. In my case with putting this together, I think some of it was just a matter of I'd used these systems before and had combined certain elements of some of these systems before and had found that they worked together in a particular way. And so that made it easy to kind of figure out a simplified approach based on just drawing on results of previous experimentation.
Good answer there. That's pretty in depth. That's kind of how I envisioned that process being is through experience and just getting back to the basics. I think some people can have analysis paralysis or preparation paralysis where they spend hours trying to find the right incense and the right timing and the right day of the week, which may be 3 months from now based on their beliefs or, thoughts. And I think that brings a lot of people back to maybe I don't want to do this right now because I don't have the time. So I think that's good. What are your thoughts on that? You see that a lot in the cult community, or?
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I'll admit it's something I run into myself, that there are times where I think, oh, I should conjure this spirit and do some work for this thing, but it's not the right day of the week, or it's not the right hour, or when that hour comes, I'm going to have this to do, so it's not going to work well. And that's part of the idea with this book is I think one of the hurdles people run into with preparation is just even putting together a simple ritual structure, putting together their tools, and saying if they haven't got that stuff together and pre-set up and ready to go, then doing that organization is going to cause them to miss the time frame that they want to use. So the book has all of the rituals in it so that you don't have to ever put anything together in that regard. And the tools that are used are all pretty simple things that for the most part are stuff people will have around their homes already or can grab at like the grocery store or Walmart or Target or something like that. And so those preparation elements are greatly reduced in order to simplify that hurdle of, oh, there's all this stuff I've got to do, even if you already know how to do it, or even if you've already conjured spirits before, because that kind of inertia doesn't just go away just because you've done it a few times. I think another element of that is sometimes people need to look at, is it better to do something and not necessarily have everything lined up and everything perfect in exactly the way you want it to be? Or is it better to do nothing because it wasn't going to be perfect? And I think in most cases, doing something is probably going to be better than doing nothing at all. There's definitely areas of life where, yeah, if you don't have a certain bare minimum, you could screw things up or make things worse by just trying to force something to work. But in a lot of areas of life, and magic is included in those, there's definitely some wiggle room of, I might not have every single tool that it says that I need. It might not be the exact day or hour that it's supposed to be, but I'm going to get something out of doing this anyway. So I should probably go ahead and do this, even if everything's not perfect in exactly the way that I want it to be, because we're always going to find ways to decide that it's not perfect. We're always going to find excuses for ways in which we're expecting that we're failing. It's just part of human nature. And sometimes we need to look past that and just accept that we're going to do a lot better and be more successful if we take the shot, because, as they say, any shot we don't take is a missed shot.
I would like to really say that I think you hit the nail on the head on is the inertia of ritual. And this goes into, I think a lot of people don't do, and I've noticed myself when I start doing it, it's like a capacitor or a battery. So even the small little Olympic altars I have set up, when I do those daily and say the prayer to them daily, it's like there's a ball of energy on that altar that just kind of builds up, and I can know it's there, I can feel it's there. And then if I have a particular spirit I don't work with for several weeks, you can see where it kind of dries up or just goes away and disperses. And I think that is kind of, if correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that's what you're kind of saying there with the inertia of the ritual is just do it, because you're building up that little magical energy. You're building up that power bank because you're getting used to it. Is that kind of what you were meaning there?
Not exactly, but it definitely ties into a lot of the idea of the book. The book presents a lot of preparations for building up that type of spiritual force and building up those sorts of spirit relationships. And personally, I find that when I am conscious of doing things like that, like waking up, saying the prayers for the day, or doing little observations and ritual engagements of the spirits with whom I work, then it does build up kind of an energy and a presence that's there, and it's easier to connect to that if you're already sort of connected to that than if you're not connected at all, or if you're just ignoring it all the time. More of what I was getting at with the idea of just getting off the bench and getting into the game is the idea that maybe you won't have as powerful of a conjuration or as powerful as a result if it's not on the right day, not in the right hour, and you're not using 6 dozen different consecrated knives that a priest has said masses over. But you're still probably going to get some effect, and some effect is probably better than no effect. So, and honestly, I don't think all of those preparations are entirely needed anyway. They can definitely add something, but you can be successful without them too. But either way, success is based on making some kind of effort. So if we make no effort at all, we're not going to ever get anywhere.
Talk a little bit more about, you're talking about getting off the bench, moving forward, and just do with it because you're going to get something out of it. One of the things that a lot of beginners into this is their fear is, well, what if I do something wrong and then my life goes to hell? Because there's always those horror stories where somebody conjured the wrong thing and then their wife left them and they lost all their money and their job and what have you. There's always those horror stories. So kind of touch a little bit on what what are some precautions as far as like these conjurings that you think and maybe presented in your book that helps take that first step more carefully?
Well, uh, the particular approach that Luminarium uses very much is centered on tying in work with your ancestors and work with your holy guardian angel. And the inclusion of those is intended partially to make your communication with the spirit world easier and more potent, but also the ancestors are there to help protect you, to help guide the way the spirits work for you, so that the spirits are presenting things in a way that is amenable to you. Um, there was a story I told on my blog once of conjuring Samael for help with something, and it resulted in a very unnerving experience in the process of trying to get everything resolved. And so I went to my ancestor altar and called upon my ancestors for help, and also called upon uh, Zadkiel and Raphael to kind of balance out and coordinate Samael's efforts. And then everything moved much more smoothly, like immediately from involving that. Like within the next like 30 minutes or so, stuff started to turn around. And sometimes there's just a matter of working with spirits in tandem with each other so that you're balancing out the ways in which those spirits work with things. And so using your ancestors who were human and understand human needs and the way humans experience things, and so they're going to be able to help guide the way that spirits are working with you and working for you, so that it's something that is actually going to be helpful in your life as opposed to something that's going to be traumatic. That can be a big step in terms of eliminating some of those things where there's the problematic experiences of spirit work. Um, your holy guardian angel also is going to kind of look out for you and attempt to guide you and make things the way that you need them to be. And so having your holy guardian angel work as a spirit that's helping coordinate the work of spirits that you're working with can also aid in that. And so those are sort of the approaches that Luminarium takes to dealing with those sorts of issues. But I would say anyone working with spirits should also just be careful about how it is that they're requesting things and how it is that they're interacting with the spirits. So if you just kind of go in with a blanket request for something and don't specify anything about ways in which you might not want that request to be fulfilled, or specifics about things that would be helpful in how the request is fulfilled, then yeah, you might have some random thing that's not really the way that you want it to be. I think for the most part, at least in my experience, I haven't had a ton of horror stories with that sort of thing happening. And I don't think it's because I've been exceptionally careful. I can be a bit sloppy about how I do things myself. So, uh, I mean, I also don't know a ton of magicians who have had a whole lot of horror stories with things like that either. I mean, I guess notably Rufus Opus with his house burning down, big horror story. Probably could have specified to the spirit things about how he did or did not want his request to be fulfilled. But aside from that story, there's not a ton of stories that I'm super familiar with of that happening. So I don't think that that should be a reason that people avoid spirit conjuration because they're afraid of their life being torn up. But also consider what spirits you're working with, how those spirits tend to do things, how you're asking for things, and what aids and guides you have there to help guide the spirit work in your life. And if you do that in kind of a healthy fashion where everything is sort of holistically blended together, then that can make that all work out a lot better.
So you're talking about working together in tandem with these different spirits and everything. Is there anything in the book or any advice that you can give? Obviously, each spirit has the governance that they have, and then they have the hierarchy that they rule below them. How would you recommend, or how does your book recommend going about finding that spirit A is complementary to spirit B? And obviously, this is a very blanket question. Just as we were talking about, don't do blanket questions, I'm going to ask you one. um, so, kind of, what are some? Does your book go into that? Because I personally, I'm one of those victims that fall into analysis paralysis, where I will look at all the attributes of, say, Raphael, and then I'll look at all the attributes of, say, Michael, and I'm like, okay, well, these two correspond, these two match together, but they're not really working together. What can you give us a little how you would run down those situations when you're preparing for something?
Well, the book keeps things pretty simple, so it doesn't get too much into the specifics of spirit hierarchies and kingdoms and things like that. And I think it's definitely something where there's a utility to exploring that, but there's also a danger of getting sort of lost in the weeds with it. And when we're dealing with angels, we can keep it pretty simple. We have plenty of sources that tell us how the angels correspond to different planets, what those planets rule over, how the angels correspond to different elements. And so we have kind of a broad sense of what things are within each of their sways individually. If we want to work with how the angels can connect to other spirits, then we can look at if, say, um, Gabriel is associated with the moon, then what other spirits are associated with the moon? and we can kind of keep it simple in that regard. But the angels are pretty easy there. There's not a whole lot of complication. Now, you can get into more complicated approaches with the angels, particularly if you look at some of the older Jewish material before there was really a structured angelic hierarchy. Or if you're trying to look at like the choirs of angels, then you can start adding some more complication there. Or when you start looking at some of the additional angels outside of kind of the main seven associated with the planets and trying to associate those with the planetary angels, that could get into where things get complicated. But I think for the most part, most people don't tend to need to run into all of that. With the demons, it can get a lot more complicated because a lot of the descriptions are much more complete, and so much of how we look at them and think of them is based on who the chiefs are, and then who the kings are, and then who the other kings underneath those kings are, and then who the various different demons are within the purview of those kings, and then who the legions are beneath those demons. And there's such a structure of that demonic set of hierarchies and kingdoms there where we kind of want them to all fit into something, but a lot of the textual material that's there doesn't clearly fit them all together. And I think as more grimoires are getting translated and as more of them are getting published and more readily available, we're starting to be able to put more of that together. And there definitely needs to be a sense of looking at it as an overall literary tradition as opposed to looking at it as, well, what does this single book say? Because that single book is the method for that book. We need to look at it as kind of a broken mythology that we've got a lot of pieces to in a lot of different structures. And even if it wasn't necessarily a consistent mythology where there was a consistent way in which the demons always behaved or in which they were always aligned with each other, we can at least see some of the pieces and some of the structures and how they sometimes fit into those pieces and structures and get something that is relatively workable and sort of move from there. Even if it was not always the way that everyone approached it, it's still a way that we can approach it as we start putting those pieces together. Now, for the purpose of the average person conjuring, the way that I approach that, sometimes I will go to my ancestor altar and I'll be like, hey, I need this. What should I do? And sometimes they'll say you should conjure this particular spirit. Other times they'll say go get this book and we'll show you which spirit in the book to conjure. And that can work fairly well. But if someone wants something that's more of a them going through and picking as opposed to looking to their spirits for guidance, or if they don't regularly work with spirits you can provide that guidance, then you can look at things like the descriptions of the demons, and if you compare with Agrippa and Rudd also, and a couple other sources, they provide explanations of how certain images tend to be associated with certain planetary forces. And so you can look for the descriptions of the appearances of the demons and see how that accords to those images. If there are notations about the directions that they come from, which unfortunately most of them don't have that there, then that can give you some idea about the planetary nature of them if you're looking for a planetary nature for them. The Book of the Offices of Spirits actually has a section where it does accord several demons under each of the four directional kings, and so you can use that as a model. The Goetia of Solomon, the court titles that are assigned to the demons, like Duke, Prelate, President, whatever else is in there, Marquis. Those are all supposed to be planetary attributions. I think there's possibly some elements of that system that are broken, that they may not consistently be correct planetary attributions, but that's one explanation that people have provided for that. So looking at the attributes in the descriptions of the demons can be a way to sort of sort some of that out and start building connections and hierarchies when you're working with those. But it's not necessarily foolproof. So sometimes I think it's more a matter of just look for ones that are described as doing what it is you need done, and maybe talk to other people and see who's had good experiences with which ones and go with that.
Very to the point, and kind of what I've deduced through the years too is when I'm not in my analysis paralysis section of planning these things out is um, there's always that cycle where you start it out, you're like, okay, we'll keep it simple, and then as you start keeping it simple, you're like, okay, well, I want to factor in this, and I want to factor in the position of the moon and the position of this planet, and then the astrological alignment, and then so you gradually build up, and then eventually, at least for me, eventually I just like, whatever, throw it all out, we're just going to do this. uh,
Uh,
just to get
I've
it
had,
done.
I've had times where running a group ritual, sometimes I'll look at what the time the ritual is going to be, and then just look at what spirit connects to that hour of the day, and I'd be like, all right, that's who we're conjuring. And it's worked out fine.
That's awesome. I noticed when I was preparing for our talk today that we're doing this in the day in the hour of Mercury. So that's a little kind of a funny little throw out to correspondences. uh, so we were talking about conjuring stuff. We're talking about just getting in there and doing it because every little bit's going to help you become better. I've always recommended conjuring and doing it properly in conjuring just to say hi for the first time, just to establish, hey, I'm so and so, you're so and so, I just want to introduce myself. What are your thoughts on that, and do you advise that towards people getting ready to do all this?
I do think that that's a good idea. I will admit that I have not been super great about that myself, and I think some of that comes from the I started reading about and experimenting with magic when I was like 11 or so, and when I got into conjuring spirits, I was in my very early 20s, and so there's not as much of that awareness of let me go out and explore this and dive in and build these spirit relationships and get to know these spirits. It's very much like, oh, I've got this thing that I want to do, and so I need to do this magic to get this done. And I think working from that perspective and having that kind of youthful enthusiasm can be great, because it means that, yeah, you are going to get off the bench and get in the game and you're just going to do it. But it doesn't necessarily lead to that deep exploration of the spirits and the spirit world and getting to know them and building relationships with them, unless that's kind of the model that's been presented to you already. And then maybe if that's sort of what you're seeing as this is how you do it, then you're going to go about doing it that way. But in my experience, it was not the way that was immediately evident to me as like, this is what I should be doing. And so I haven't built a habit of that. But there are spirits that I have worked with in the last several years where maybe I hadn't worked with them before, and so I did start my approach to them that way, of calling them, being like, hey, tell me about yourself, tell me what I can learn from you, tell me what you can help me with, tell me about how to contact you. And I think that's one of the things actually that a lot of people miss in spirit conjuration. The grimoires are meant to introduce you to a spirit. They're not necessarily meant to be the system that you're always working. Once you are introduced to a spirit through that system, the spirit should be able to tell you how to call it in the future. And so that might be a secret name for the spirit, it might be a secret seal, it might be a particular ritual action or approach, or it might be them consecrating some tool through which you can call them. But you should be able to build methods for interacting with spirits once you have gone through that get to know you phase with the spirit. Like the grimoires are kind of the formal courtship, and then you once you're familiar with them, then there's other ways to interact with them. So it's definitely a good idea to do that. Definitely a good idea to call them, introduce yourself, and just kind of get to know them at first.
Of course, the occult and esoteric studies, they're an evolutionary thing, right? We're like you said, translating old grimoires still. We do not have all the knowledge in front of us. I don't think we ever will or ever had all the knowledge in front of us. But I see a trend evolving to where that's becoming more of the focus of the introductory, get to know them, build that relationship. Aaron Leach is big about that, where his Abramelin practice and everything is like, that's where you learn how to actually do magic, where everything up to that is just introducing yourself and getting your feet wet. But once you get in contact with your holy guardian angel, that's when you actually do magic. That's kind of his big thing. And Jason Miller and all of them is all about getting familiar with the spirits. So I think it seems like that's the trend where we're starting to evolve and move into. I've always been curious because you mentioned direction several times, where when you evoke a spirit, the direction you come from or where they come from. Joseph Peterson's into that, and it seems to be the underlying trend, but no one really digs in, at least that I've seen, as to why. What are your thoughts on direction? Because we're in a quasi, I don't know, multi-dimensional sphere that you have 360 directions. Why does east matter more than west? And where is east and west? And you can get into the semantics of all that, but what are your thoughts on the direction of things?
Well, I think in a very basic sense, the way that a lot of us who have been involved in magic for a while kind of were introduced to the idea of directionality was usually either a focus on the east or a focus on the north. And if you were focusing on the east, it was probably because you were in a system that was more influenced by the Golden Dawn and the OTO and various ceremonial magic schools of thought. And so it was drawing on sort of the Masonic idea of the rising sun, and your angel or divinity was associated with the rising sun. And so everything is oriented towards the east because of that. If you were working a system where everything's oriented towards the north, then it's a system that is generally going to be a little bit more neo-pagan influenced, and so the earth is associated with the north, and you have kind of the earth mother. Sometimes the undying lands are associated with either the north or the west, and so in systems where they're associated with the north, then that ties into that same sort of earth mother, source of everything association with the north. And I think for a long time that was pretty much it for what people thought about directions. And then there was, of course, the whole idea of, well, I can't situate my altar facing to the east, but I should be looking east. So magically, that's going to be the east. It's going to be my temple east. And so when I'm in my magical space, then that's east for now, even though it's really west, and everything will just be accorded based on that. And I think what we're starting to see now is, as people are exploring more deeply into some of the grimoire texts, and particularly as we're looking at some of the earlier grimoires, then we're starting to see that there is a consistent association of particular spirits with particular directions. And the idea there is that the spirit resides in that direction, and so when you conjure the spirit, it should arrive from that direction. And so the fact that it arrives from that given direction is part of how we identify that it's the actual spirit that's being conjured. So there was a long time where people were like, oh, you have to test the spirit, you have to test the spirit to make sure that it's the right spirit. And the Golden Dawn had its whole system for certain like signs and passwords and words and grips and everything that you would use to test the spirit the way that you would test a person, because again, it was operating in kind of a Masonic sort of worldview. But in traditional grimoire magic, you're looking at, is the spirit behaving the way that this spirit should be? Does the spirit come from the direction that it's supposed to come from? Does it have elements of appearance and signs that relate to the way that that spirit should have appearance and signs? And if I bind the spirit by a divine name and compel the spirit to give me its name, does it give me the right name? Um, so the directionality is an important part of that, as far as understanding the spirit that you're calling is the right spirit. So when you face to a given direction, you are anticipating the spirit's coming from that direction. Part of that also, aside from just testing the spirit, it makes sense if the spirit lives in the north, then you're going to face the north when you call it, as opposed to facing east or west, because like if you're talking to a person, you're going to look towards that person when you talk to them. You're not going to look away. It's like you're not really paying attention to them if you're doing that. Now, as far as the idea of what's meaningful about these directions, it's pretty easy and maybe reductive to say that the spirit lives in that direction, so we call it from that direction. But the directions have a sort of correspondence to them themselves. So if we look at the idea of the world being a series of kind of linked phases of creation, or rays exuding from the heavenly spheres into the world, then we would associate those rays more particularly, or those rulerships more particularly, with particular places and particular areas. And so when we're dividing out the directions, then we would say that, okay, anything under the influence of Jupiter is associated with this direction, anything under the influence of Mars is associated with this direction. And that's something that, if we go back to the time of like the formation of the Old Testament stories, we see that in the story of Noah. His children are sent off into different directions and populate the world. And so each direction is then associated with the different descendants of Noah, and then all the peoples of those directions are associated with the different children of Noah. And so there was a point in kind of the way that maps were formed, and the way that understandings of the division of humanity, and therefore also of the regions in which people lived, were based on these associations, and then that extended to associations with particular angels and particular spirits. And we see this in pagan context too, where peoples had particular gods that were associated with ruling their tribe or ruling their kingdom or their people, as sort of a patron or a benefactor. And so the world kind of basically has this element of people and places being divided out under the auspices of different spiritual powers. And so by the time we get to the point where the grimoires are being put together, there's sort of a, I guess, kind of Neoplatonic influence of these powers being understood through the different planetary rays and the radiation from the planets. And so these directions are based on association with planetary rulership. And so then when a spirit comes from a particular direction or resides in a particular direction, it has to do with what powers under which that spirit is ruled. And that's why it comes from there. So there is kind of a metaphysical, esoteric reason for why the spirits are associated with the direction. It has to do with rulership, um, as opposed to just like, hey, well, I want to look in this direction because it's a symbol. So that's why there's that importance of directionality, and it's something that I think is becoming more popular as we get out of that mindset of the circle being a space outside of place and a time outside of time, and out away from that kind of more modern approach to magic as being separate from the rest of the world, and looking at it as magic in the context of the overall nature of creation. That, as Jake Stratton Kent would say, we're not being transcendentalist about it. We're looking at magic as being something that we're doing within the space of the earth. And so elements like direction and like time have importance within the way that things are within creation.
I love at the end when you define how you're not being transcendental, you're actually focusing more on the earthly environment, you know, the Malkuth, if you would say, of the matter, which I think helps to the overall goal of simplifying it, because we're only so much brain capacity, and if we try to say, okay, now we're going to take into account all these external variables that may or may not make a difference, I think we just blow it out of proportion. So that little bit kind of blew my mind a little bit. I'm like, I had a little click in my head, like, okay, that makes sense. I like that. So let's look at this here. Now, you're talking about you had a test group that people have worked these systems for a few weeks and they kind of got some feedback. As we start to wrap up here, is there any kind of little teaser you can give us for maybe one of the examples from the test group, or one of the feedback you gave us, or you can give us?
Well, one of the testers had sort of an interesting. Well, actually, all the testers had kind of neat stuff as far as putting the materials together. So there were about 10 people that I sent manuscripts to in order to sort of review it and test it and to get editing done before actually putting it out. From those people, 4 of them came back and had actually done full conjurations and had experimented with the preparations and had an explanation of what they experienced with their conjurations. And I think there are some interesting descriptions in there, and so it'll be interesting for people to get a chance to read those. And I think also it's kind of a little unique, because usually when people present a magic book, it's just, hey, here's the stuff to do. Every now and again, you'll get somebody who is like, here's my experience with what's in here. But it's pretty unusual to say, like, okay, here's a bunch of people who tried this and this is what they got. As far as an example goes, aside from the tool gathering, where, I mean, like, literally one person had one of the things they need just show up randomly in their mail that day, unordered. There were like a lot of little things like that where people had stuff that they were waiting on that showed up, or things where somebody just gave them something. One person realized that they had a plant in their yard that was the plant that was needed, that they didn't know was there. And so there was a lot of cool circumstances around that. In terms of in the actual conjurations, one person, as they were getting to the conjuration of the angel, they had, I guess, candles in wine bottles to light up the space that they were in, and not just like in the actual ritual space, but throughout the room. And one of the wine bottles, the candle like exploded from the bottle during the conjuration. And then when they went to check it after the ritual was done, the wax that had remained had formed into kind of a crude shape of an angel hugging onto the wine bottle. And they showed me a picture of it, and it looked like if you gave some clay to a child and child sculpted an angel, like that's what it would look like. And it was something where it was pretty clear as far as the way that it looked. And so it was kind of not something that was like, oh, here's a cool result of having done the magic, but kind of one of those neat side things that happens when you're doing magic, that you have little effects that show the presence of a spirit that aren't the thing that you're looking for. They're not the thing that you're necessarily expecting, but they're ways in which the spirit is like, hey, look, I'm here, and I'm going to manipulate the space around you in some way physically to show you that there's something going on. And I think those are some of the really neat things that come up with magic. One of the other testers did have several results as far as the actual goal that she had with receiving. She's working for a promotion for her husband, and there were like 4 things that happened within the next couple days that provided additional money and support towards facilitating him doing the things he needed for the promotion, like well beyond what she was expecting to have happen. And so there were some interesting results that people had with it, and I look forward to people getting to see those, because I think that'll be kind of an important thing, especially because the people that I selected for it was kind of a range of experience levels, but mostly on the new to intermediate level of things. And so they're people who their level of experience, their level of working with things is going to be similar to a lot of people who are picking up the book and saying, okay, I've never done a conjuration. Let me go ahead and try a conjuration. In fact, the person who had the multiple things happening with helping her husband on the promotion just been doing magic for about a year. And so was very new to things like this. So I think that's going to be a really great element that people are going to be able to see, that other people who are not super experienced or super beyond them in terms of their knowledge and experience are able to use it and be successful and have things happen.
Yes. I think that's where a lot of people get turned away from magic, is when they go through the ritual, but they're not tuned enough to feel the energies in the room or to feel that it's working. And then the longevity to results usually is longer than memory. So you don't really remember that, oh, I did this to get this, but you got it. And I think that's a detractor to a lot of people who jump into this. So having those small little wins, like the wine bottle breaking or those synchronicities, I think that really goes a long way to keep people in the practice. And I love those things. I just love when that happens to me, because it's like, oh, okay, I know you're here, you know. And it's kind of like, have you heard of Frederick Xavier?
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Well, he's on YouTube, and he does a lot of kind of what we do. And one of the things he does is he just has this sigil he puts up there for people who are like new to his YouTube channel. And he's like, just look at this. And for the longest time, he didn't tell you what it was. And over time, people kept on saying, you know, what is this? What is this? And he's like, how many people have had an orange ball appear somewhere randomly in their yard or their house? And like all these people are commenting that, oh yeah, you know, it was, I did. And even me. And he did that to prove a point that subconsciously you're still enacting these sigils, and that these weird synchronicities, like the orange ball coming to all of you, is part of the magical process to kind of let you know, hey, it's working, right? So I love it. Even the scientific aspect of the wine bottle exploding, provided that it wasn't corked, obviously it couldn't be because the candle wouldn't be burning, like the imperfections in the glass to allow it to get hot enough, just enough to explode at that moment of conjuration, like it's astronomical, the probability of that happening. So it's definitely divine, if you want to put it that way. I love it. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about kind of when this book's going to be out and where they can get it at.
Well, it should be out by the end of this week. The Kindle edition actually went up for pre-order today, and so I'm going to be posting some stuff with that link soon. But sometime between Friday and Sunday, the paperback edition should be available on Amazon as well. I know there are some people who don't like to deal with Amazon or don't like to purchase from Amazon, and so I'm also expanding out to work with Barnes & Noble, and so that will take a couple extra weeks just because some of the proof review is a little slower for them than it is with Amazon. But hopefully in a week or two, I should have things up and running at Barnes & Noble, and then Barnes & Noble will be available for ordering paperback as well as a hardback edition, which won't be available through Amazon. That'll just be available through Barnes & Noble. And my previous book, Living Spirits, will also be expanding onto Barnes & Noble, and we'll also have a hardback edition available through Barnes & Noble once all of that is up and running.
I look forward to that. That's something that I'm going to have to pick up myself, and kind of I'll provide you some feedback when I work through it. How about that?
I look forward to hearing it.
Yeah. Well, anything else you want to tell the listeners or potential readers of anything you want to, any advice for the magical community?
Well, I would just say the big thing is get out there and do something. The more you do, the more opportunity you'll have to see things happening, and the more you'll be able to understand what it is that's available to you through Magick. And there's something that's very fulfilling and very helpful with that experience, whether you go on to become someone who's consistently working with Magick and exploring Magick, or if it's just something that adds a little bit more wonder to your life, or kind of an interesting story that you can tell later on. It's worth getting out there and trying it, and it's not as hard to get out there and try it as sometimes people think, or sometimes it sounds.
I just want to thank everyone who's listening to this, and I hope you all go out and buy BJ's new book, The Luminarium. I'm going to personally start working with it, and once I receive my copy, and we will probably touch base a little bit on the future of how I went about it and how it worked. So just support your local occult author. Local meaning Earth, right? Because who knows where you're at and who knows where he's at. Let's just support each other. And speaking of support, if you'd like to have more of these, check out patreon.com and support the Esoteric Scholar. For only a couple bucks a month, you can really help let me know that you like what I'm doing. Alrighty. I hope you all have a good evening and enjoy it.